bestowed. Sangha signifying therefore, or showing therefore, that through practicing exchanging self and others, you will come to fully realize bodhicitta, through which you will realize supreme enlightenment. So Rinpoche concludes this section on explaining training with phrases by saying, as you recite the words of the holy ones, so like these quotations from Shantideva and Tsongkhapa and other sources that one might want to add to this, firmly recollect their meaning. Of course, he's saying it's not sufficient to parrot these like a bird might imitate human speech. We have to fully take into our heart the meaning and the significance of what we're saying. It's like I was trying to suggest. Actually, when we say these phrases, we should consider how astounding what we're saying really is. How opposite, one might say, to worldly common assumptions. What an enormous reversal of our habits is embodied in these phrases. Almost like we should say, did I really say that? I really said, I want to give all my happiness to others. Wow, I really said that. Well, therefore I must live up to it. It's like Shantideva says in Bodhitavatara, in chapter 4, called Concern, which follows the chapter on taking the Bodhisattva vow. Shantideva expresses this like, one just said this amazing thing in which one promised in the presence of all the Buddhas to liberate all sentient beings. That's astonishing and enormous, what I said. Now I better live up to it. So that's the point here. One should say these phrases by fully kind of putting one's mind with them, so that this change in one's heart becomes, so to speak, permanent. A change in one's heart, that one opens one's heart to the world. And you know, when you open your heart to the world comes in. And we better be prepared for that. As a great poet said. So, now, one last line from the root text in this point number 2. Geshe Chekawa says, in the root text, begin the sequence of exchange with oneself. So here's a special instruction that some people may find very useful, which is to actually start the practice of taking with regard to your own sufferings. So Rinpoche says, although the practice in its proper sequence, although the practice of sending and taking should be carried out normally in the way we've indicated, is concerned with exchanging with the suffering of others. In order to become accustomed to this, begin by taking on your own suffering. In other words, it may well be that you feel some kind of weight of negative karma is obstructing you, and therefore, and that will get in the way of you fully practicing exchanging oneself for others, taking on the suffering of others onto yourself. So to clear that weight of negative karma away, if you need to, or if you wish to, you practice by taking on your own suffering initially, and then proceed to take on the suffering of others. So to explain this more, Rinpoche says, think that all of the suffering one has experienced up till now and will experience in future lifetimes, together with its causes, is gathered into this present body. So as again, in your meditation practice, having done the preliminaries that have been explained, then this is where you go to. You start in this way with your own suffering. think that all the negativity you do and all the results of that, the suffering that you're having and will have in the future, is gathered into this present body and gathers and ripens upon this mind of self-cherishing. Rinpoche doesn't say so, but you could imagine that this suffering and negativities is also in the form of a black air, black pollution, which is absorbed into you. Due to this, due to absorbing it, to taking it in this way, your suffering and negativities, due to absorbing it in this way, grasping at I, the notion of I, or the notion of mine, my possessions, and so on. In other words, as Rinpoche describes it, the groundless confusion of unawareness. Groundless confusion means, really, this I that I'm so attached to, that I'm so cherishing, it's not really there. It's actually just imaginary, just a fictional habit, a fictional projection, a label I'm projecting. But there's nothing beyond that, nothing solid there in the first place. So it's groundless. But nevertheless, it's the confusion which leads to all these negative actions and all the resultant sufferings that come from that. So it's the source of all suffering. So when you meditate, all this negativity of yours is coming into your heart, you imagine it smashes, as Rinpoche say, it smashes this imaginary I, this fictional ego. It smashes it into dust, and the wisdom of non-self is realized. So, Rinpoche says, it is said that any qualities attained through this purification should be used to help us take suffering from others. In other words, if one can do this, then one has created a space. One's heart is unlocked. Right now, it's like our heart is locked by the grasping at I, the grasping at self, the grasping at me. So if we can do this, take on the sufferings and negativities that we have created, that we have caused for ourselves, and use it to annihilate, to smash this fictional entity of the self in the heart, our heart is unlocked, is opened. And now we have room to take on the suffering of others. So the obstacle, the blockage caused by self-clinging is dissolved. And we can now proceed into the main practice. Now, Rinpoche says, one might wonder now, due to this strong stress on smashing the clinging to I, is this being the case, is there any reason to care for oneself? So, to answer that, it's quite a long and quite a subtle answer, so we'll follow it through. To answer this, consider the following. The self or ego, that which functions, as we've just said, as the ground of suffering, has no existence whatsoever. It never has been there. You see, it's not that one is really annihilating one's ego or one's self. How can you annihilate that which was never there in the beginning? You cannot. So it's like, when you've got nothing to lose. And that's our case. We're not going to lose an ego. How can we lose that which wasn't there in the first place? So there's no need to be fearful or frightened of or resistant of this. Yet, although there is nothing there, I believe there is. I believe there is a self and an I. and based on that I divide myself from others, and based on that division between self and others, disturbing emotions arise in me. Those disturbing emotions prompt negative actions, which create suffering, all due to some imagination, or put it another way, to a tragic mistake that I keep making again and again and again, inventing this fictional entity who I then want to protect. So, therefore, it is imperative to pop that bubble, to pop that delusion of self. Because as Rinpoche says, although it has no existence whatsoever, and therefore there's no reason to fear letting go of it, yet by clinging to it and cherishing it, this imaginary entity, we accumulate various actions based on attachment and aversion, from which all the suffering of the world arises. Therefore, it is vital to abandon self-clinging. Now, Rinpoche wants to add something further point of advice, lest we take this advice to free ourselves from self-clinging in a kind of over-exaggerated or negative way. We kind of substantialize it. You'll see what this means. Because one might think, oh, if I shouldn't care for myself, I should let go of ego and self-clinging, then why do I need to look after this body and so on and so forth? Shouldn't that also be just disregarded? But that is not the case, as Rinpoche says. However, this body of ours is the fruit of the previous accumulation of merit. One is born in this human world due to causes which are harmonious with the result. The result is human life. The causes must be of a similar nature, because results and causes must always be in a continuum. So the sources or causes of me being reborn as a human are that in the past I have done virtuous actions. So this human life is wonderful because it has come about through my diligent development of virtue in the past. And furthermore, when used in the service of the Holy Dharma, it is an excellent support for liberation. As Gampopa tells us in the Jewel Ornament of Liberation, all beings can achieve Buddhahood because the causal essence of Buddhahood, the Ju, exists in all sentient beings. That is chapter 1 of the Tajin, of the Jewel Ornament. But chapter 2, or point 2 of the Tajin, is we need to have the working basis, the ten, the support. Because just like a seed, if it doesn't have the right soil and water and so on, it will not come to fruition. And human life, human birth, provides that right environment, that right setting for the seed of Buddha nature. So being born human and contacting the Dharma makes this situation of the precious human life, endowed with the freedoms and endowments. So in short, as Rinpoche says, this human body we have now is an excellent support for liberation. So for this reason, we should value it. I mean, we should value our body and our life, and look after it with food, clothing, medicine, and so on, because it can serve this wonderful purpose. And again, if we look in Shantideva, in chapter 1 of Bodhicharvatara, he says there that when the bodhicitta arises in us, it's like an alchemy. This ordinary human body is turned into a wish-fulfilling gem, which can grant all wishes. So, we should look after and preserve this body in the way Rinpoche says. But this being said, so as we acknowledge that, since we have given our body away to sentient beings, in other words, since we use our body as a servant to help us to serve sentient beings, that's what the purpose of being here is for us, once we've entered the Bodhisattva way. Although we should look after the body, there is no reason to cling to self, because my body is really just, so to speak, for the service of others. So don't confuse this point that one should look after the body with the idea, I should cherish my body and cherish myself. As Shantideva says, having freely given this body for the wealth of all sentient beings, they may beat it and so on as they please. For what reason should I cherish this? And as Shantideva is counseling us that really we should be patient, whatever difficulties other people may cause for us, because we already promised we're here just to serve them. So we shouldn't we shouldn't have a kind of, so to speak, angry attitude or angry response or defensive response to the negativities others may cause for us out of their delusion, because they're just suffering beings and we're here to serve them. And you can see from this how in later parts of this text how this attitude of the giving away our body to the benefit of others will be carried out in Lojong. So that ends point 2 of the teaching, and we come to point 3, the transformation of adverse conditions or negative conditions, difficult conditions, into the path of awakening. One might say, at this point, one might think this is very inspiring and so on, to develop the bodhisattva attitude of care for others, exchanging oneself for others. But could I keep this going? Could I maintain this attitude and this practice when things get rough, when times get troubled, when difficulties arise in my life and in the world? Like cynically one might say, it's very easy to have beautiful ideals when everybody around you is pleasant and pleasing and times are good, there's no difficulties, planes run on time, the taxi arrives on time to take you to the airport, etc., etc., and you don't look at social media and see the pictures of politicians who want to blow up your world. If you don't have all those things, then it's easy to practice Lojong and be a bodhisattva. But what about when you meet all those things, when there's trouble? And there's always trouble. That's the kind of secret name of samsara. So what to do about that? Well, Geshe Chekawa has some advice for us. It's the first line in point 3. When the world and its inhabitants are full of negativity, transform those very negative circumstances into the path of enlightenment. In other words, it's like another astounding teaching from perspective of Lojong, because our perspective will be that I can practice the Lojong if everything's nice and quiet and I really get on with it, but really I have to shy away from, I have to avoid difficulties, I have to avoid problems, and that's the only way I can develop spiritually, if I avoid difficulties and problems. But the Lojong attitude is totally different. No, we can deal with those difficulties. Okay, one must say, okay, that means neutralize them. That means at least, in a way, subdue them so that they can be thrown away. No. The Lojong attitude is not that. The Lojong attitude is even more radical. They can become part of the path to enlightenment if one has the special method, the secret code, as somebody was talking about. Not the one Leonard Cohen was talking about. The secret bodhisattva code of transforming negative conditions into the path of enlightenment. So, Rinpoche will explain this line. When the wealth of the world's external environment is damaged, so he's going to give some examples, we could say, of difficulties, of adverse circumstances. When the wealth of the world's external environment is damaged by harms from the four elements, so like earthquakes, floods, fire, hurricanes, etc., and also deteriorates, the external environment deteriorates due to the effect of man-made toxins or poisons, pollution in other words, and so on. So that's the world, the container, when there's negativity in the container, and then when there's negativity in that which is contained in the world, sentient beings, the inhabitants of the world. So when the strength of the 5 poisons of sentient beings, 5 poisons, ignorance and aggression and desire, pride, jealousy, these 5 poisons. When the strength of those 5 poisons, 5 turbulent emotions of sentient beings increases and causes their body, their speech and their minds to be full of non-virtue and negative conduct. So, that's both the world itself and the beings when they are disturbed and things go wrong. However these negative conditions manifest for you, don't accumulate negativity for yourself, non-virtuous karma, by apportioning blame, by reacting with aggression back towards the world, or with aggression back towards sentient beings who are behaving badly due to their disturbing emotions. So what to do? So Rinpoche says, well, look at the example, for instance, of Jetsun Milarepa. Although Jetsun Milarepa and his mother, so I think everybody's read the biography of Jetsun Milarepa, so I don't need to go into that. Although Jetsun Milarepa and his mother had immeasurable suffering inflicted on them by their close relatives, from these events in Milarepa's life as a child, a young man, arose the auspicious conditions for the attainment of Buddhahood in one life. Jetsun Milarepa is one of the most extraordinary of masters because he truly achieved the level of Vajradhara, supreme Buddhahood, in this life, having started with such negative conditions. So he was able to use the negative conditions as the fuel, so to speak, the petrol for the vehicle to lead to supreme Buddhahood. So remembering Milarepa's example as encouragement, Rinpoche says, therefore whatever misfortunes and happinesses, difficulties befall you, happen to you, it is essential to transform them into the path of enlightenment. So now the text will go on to teach us the methods for transforming negative conditions into the path of enlightenment. And he'll do so by firstly explaining how to use the methods of relative bodhicitta, essentially exchanging oneself for others, practicing sending and taking, how to use those methods first when trouble arises, to convert that very trouble into the path to enlightenment. And then it will teach us how to use the standpoint of ultimate bodhicitta practice, ultimate lojong, so to speak, lojong of ultimate bodhicitta. And then after that, it will explain to us what are called the four forces, the four skills, Zhuozhi, the four skills, or the four practices, as the translators put it here. So the first one then is using relative bodhicitta as the method for pacifying all physical and mental suffering and making them into the path to enlightenment, converting them into path to enlightenment. So, just to make a comment here, usually we consider that it is only the Vajrayana teachings which are a method of transforming negativity into the path to enlightenment. And that is indeed one of the great features of the Vajrayana. But here, in the non-tantric teaching of the Mahayana, there's also a method of transforming negativity into the path to enlightenment, and it is the Lojong teaching. So the root text begins this section on transforming negativity through relative bodhicitta with the line from root text, drive all blame into one. Drive all blame into one. So this needs a lot of explanation. Rinpoche will provide that for us. You see, actually, we do already practice driving all blame into one. That is to say, whenever anything bad happens to me, I always drive it into you. It's your fault. It's his fault. It's her fault. It's my parents' fault. It's the government's fault. It's the education's fault. It's the church's fault. It's always somebody else. So we do practice driving all blame into one. We're very good at it. It's just the wrong one. That is the point from the perspective of bodhicitta. Because if we don't reverse this habit, it will very quickly destroy our lojong. We might in the meditation sincerely practice and create a little bit of space to exchange self and others, but it will be undermined immediately. We return to the everyday world with its numerous difficulties. So you've got to take hold of that habitual reaction of blaming others and turn it around. So, Rinpoche comments on this line. Whatever happens to you, or those close to you, whether it's a physical malady, physical illness, mental suffering, or bad gossip, or reprimands, somebody telling you off, lawsuits, robberies, or beatings, even if you think it has happened due to the actions of visible enemies. So you know, oh, it is this person who is criticizing me, or that person who is causing trouble for me, that's a visible enemy, or invisible enemies, meaning like spirits, as it says, such as dun, malevolent spirits, or geks, obstacle causers, or even something done through the use of divination, or somebody casting a horoscope for you and to use it to harm you because they know your weak spots or something. So whatever it is, whether it's something out there in the ordinary world or some kind of use of spiritual forces, spiritual practices, magical practices, whichever way the harm comes, do not blame the others. Do not blame these. Because that's not the root cause of the trouble that is now presently seems to be inflicted on one. Where does the notion of enemy come from? So Rinpoche, as we say, this ignorant mind, grasping at a self within the continuum of mind, so there's our mind stream, which is just the union of emptiness and luminosity, flowing on from moment to moment, life to life. In it there is no substantially existent self, no permanent, autonomous, singular entity, which I can call a real self. But I believe there is. I project that fictional entity onto the mind stream. And so doing that, projecting that self onto the continuum of mind, gives rise to a division of beings between self, which I'm now clinging to as here, and others out there. And upon this basis of this dualistic division between self and others, there arise the variety of non-virtuous actions. So this process that is continuously happening from moment to moment of grasping itself and then dividing the world into self versus other, that is as Rinpoche says, this alone, as surely as taking poison will result in your death, this alone yokes us or chains us to suffering in beginningless samsara. So that is the root cause. Enemies come from this process within the mind. Nowhere else. Reflect on this and drive all blame onto one thing alone, our destructive clinging to self, as Rinpoche says. So he says, tame ego clinging through scripture and reason, meaning to support this reversal of our habit, this reversal of driving blame onto others, now driving it onto yourself, seeing yourself clinging as a source of all your enmity with the world, your division with the world, which has brought about suffering. To support this, study and reflect on the words of the Buddha and the great shastras of the masters, the commentaries on the Buddha's words, because they're the manifestations of enlightened speech. They're absolutely mistaken, since Buddha was endowed with limitless omniscience, and even the masters who composed the shastras composed those in total accord with the Buddha's teachings. They did it with minds set on liberation. So as the sources of the teachings are unmistaken, so we can have complete confidence in them. By studying those, you will come to see that it is the grasping itself which is a source of enemies. Maintain faith and conviction in your heart in the teachings. And like Shantideva says in Bodhisattva chapter 8, if all harms in this world, whatever they are, and fears and sufferings, as great as they are, come into being by grasping at a self, then what use is this great demon to me? The great demon is the self. We have the idea of the external demons, whether in human form or spirit form, afflicting me. But the real demon is my self-clinging. And that self-clinging, the self I've been cherishing and clinging to since the beginning of this time, it's almost like you have an employee who's been working for you for many years. You call him into your office and say, what have you done for me? I've got a list. You've just caused me trouble. You've never achieved anything beneficial. Did you ever protect me? No. Did you cause me trouble? Yes. So I'm giving you the sack. You are fired. You're fired immediately. So that is what we should think. We should ask ourselves, be an accountant. Call self-clinging, your attachment to self, to account. Add up the books. He's no credit at all. He is completely in deficit. When you have an employee like that, as I say, you get rid of them immediately. What use is this great demon to me? You're imaginary, yet you've caused me all this trouble. And furthermore, Rinpoche says, call on the objects of refuge, the Lama and the three jewels, for aid, for help in this dismissing of self-clinging, and try and endeavor in supplicating them to grant the realization of the basic state of non-self. So when we encounter difficult situations, we have to look not to you've got to cut it at the source. That is the point. It's no use dealing with the last symptoms, so to speak, this trouble happening for me now. You've got to ask, where does it come from? And when you trace it back, you will find the cause of it is really self-clinging. So therefore, if that's the troublemaker, you need to practice the Dharma to have the confidence and strength to overcome that habitual clinging to self. So call upon that is why we take refuge. That is why we supplicate the Lama and the three jewels for their blessing. To realize that self, which is the troublemaker, was never there in the first place. To realize the basic state of non-self, our fundamental nature. Because although the self-clinging, the self to which we're clinging, is an enormous troublemaker, really actually it should be no trouble to get rid of it, because it was never there in the first place. It's just this silly habit we have, this ridiculous habit we have of believing in this fictional entity. So we need to look at it in that way. As Rinpoche says, in summary, to sum up this point, having awakened into the Mahayana family and generated the mind of supreme enlightenment, rely on skillful means to attain unsurpassable awakening. So Mahayana family means that, as is explained in the chapter 1 of Jewel Ornament, through karmic reasons, we all, in this life, we belong to one or other divisions or families in terms of our proximity to realizing Buddha nature. And the nearest, the best family is to have the Mahayana, be in the Mahayana family. It means even without hearing the teachings, we're like instinctually drawn towards Mahayana attitudes. So, however unbelievable it is, in this present life, for us, this good karma has ripened, which leads to us being in the Mahayana family. Then we've generated the bodhicitta. We've fulfilled this connection we have with the Mahayana through making the bodhisattva vow. So now we should rely on these skillful means of the Lojong teaching to attain Buddhahood. And the essence of the path of Buddhahood is, as Rinpoche says, the exchange of self and other in both thought, in our intentions, and our actions. So it's important to apply this exchange of self and others as much as you can, as well as you can, in all situations, by driving all blame into one, which is the self, the clinging to self, the root of all our troubles. Rinpoche says, to kind of inspire us, to have the confidence to do this, consider the manner, because we might be fearful. We might be fearful of doing this and think it's still, what I should do is really go out and destroy those outer enemies, overcome those outer obstacles, because they're causing me suffering. So if we have that fear, then Rinpoche says, consider the manner in which the Buddha first produced the mind of supreme enlightenment. And as when Buddha first generated bodhicitta and began his journey to Buddhahood. It's a story has been told many times. So while still an ordinary being, before even entering the bodhisattva path, Buddha took the agony afflicting the head of another upon himself, as I mentioned before, when he was reborn in hell due to the negative actions of harming his actual mother. Then he was reborn in hell. And at that time, seeing the torture inflicted on another being born in hell alongside him, he interceded and requested that the suffering that his fellow was having be inflicted upon him himself. In dependence upon the tiny seed of compassion thus engendered, just that arose in this way, in Buddha seeing the suffering of another and thinking, I'll take it from him. Through that, he then meditated through many lifetimes subsequent to this moment, following that moment, until the attainment of Buddhahood. Then, after attainment of Buddhahood, he turned the wheel of the holy Dharma and dispelled the suffering of numerous sentient beings who were to be trained, and as those who had the karma to be his disciples, to be his students, and were therefore, to say, the field of his activity, he showed them the way to overcome suffering and guided them along the path of liberation. And this astounding activity of the Buddha, which still continues in a way to this day, it all began with that one moment in the hell where he took the suffering of others on himself. That little bit of courage, that little bit of change of direction, because prior to them, Buddha had been, the one who had become Buddha, had been filled with resentment, filled with anger at the world. He went through all kinds of sufferings in the life preceding hell, which he said were caused by his mother lying to him about the occupation of his father, and because she didn't want to lose him. So he became very angry with his mother because of that, and actually kicked her in the head. So in the subsequent next life, he's reborn in hell. So he's like on this downward path through blaming others. But then this one moment of space occurs. He takes the suffering, he's willing to take the sufferings of others, and that reverses, in a way, unlocks hell for him, and he begins the upward journey to Buddhahood. So we should take confidence from that we have to stop blaming others and see the blame coming from where it really comes from, which is our clinging to self. Also, so one can, to again further inspire oneself to do this, also consider that among all the activities of Milarepa and others, it is through equalizing and exchanging self and other that they attain the final fulfillment of the Bodhisattva conduct. However, so there's many examples of this. Now Rinpoche says, just in case we misunderstand what is being said here, it would not be correct to exchange self and others, to practice taking the sufferings of others onto oneself, for instance, by, for example, deliberately setting out to catch an infectious disease. Because then, as a result of catching this infectious disease, preoccupied with the miseries of coughing, sneezing, and so on, one would be of no use to others whatsoever. So you don't go out looking for trouble. Trouble will find you. Because again, it's possible, you see, with Dharma teachings, it is possible to diminish them by not taking them seriously and say, oh, that's not really so, I don't need to do that. Or exaggerate them by over-substantializing them and applying them in contexts where they're not to be applied literally. And this, of course, is out of type of pride. So it's a form of self-clinging. So therefore, like Rinpoche is saying, you don't need to go out deliberately looking for sickness, to take the suffering through sickness of others onto yourself. It will be there. Nevertheless, if it is possible to take another person's sickness, for instance, to talk about that, this should be done. One should do this. One should not shun others who are sick and try and avoid them, but one should be, with an open heart, with compassion, be willing to take their sickness on to yourself. Of course, karmically, it cannot befall you, but you should still have the courage to be open to those who are sick in this way. For instance, as Rinpoche says, exactly as the great Jalsit Tome. Jalsit Tome was the great Sakya and Kadam master from the 14th century, wrote the 37 practices of a bodhisattva's child. He also wrote a very important, beautiful commentary on Lojong Dondumma, 7 Points of Mind Training, and a commentary on Bodhicharvatara. So he's a very famous master and a wonderful example of a bodhisattva. As Rinpoche says, he swapped his good woolen garments, his monastic robes, for a beggar's lice-infested rags and wore them without revulsion. So this is a great example of a bodhisattva. If the power of the compassion of the sage, the Buddha, is present, as it was in this example, Jalsit Tome, or Guru Maitri Yogin, one of the three masters of Atisha, who we talked about, who had this astonishing compassion for suffering inflicted on dogs, or Jessa Milarepa, when he accepted poison. I think you know the story in the Namta, the history of Milarepa, composed in the 15th century. It said that the end of his life came about when the jealous Geshe Sakpua, who was so jealous of Milarepa's reputation that he offered him food but mixed it with poison. But Jessa Milarepa courageously, to take the sufferings of others, including the Geshe, onto himself, he drank the poisoned soup. So this is the right way to practice if one has the power of compassion of the Buddhas. However, of course, since we now are still enslaved by attachment and self-interest, it is very difficult to us to do exactly as they do. We don't yet have that great heart and that big mind. Therefore, make aspiration prayers, Monlam, that we will come to possess this ability in this and all future lifetimes, and practice sending and taking. So if you do not able yet to do this exchange to the extent of these great bodhisattvas, don't be discouraged, but make aspiration. May I one day be able to do this, and practice sending and taking, which rides the horse of the breath. It's like you put the meditation as a rider on the horse. The horse is the outgoing and ingoing of the breath. In this way, by training this way, you'll come to possess that astonishing compassion of the bodhisattvas. And again, to help with this, having during this good eon, this fortunate eon, encountered the Vajrayana, so this is a way that Vajrayana practitioners can train in this. Having encountered the Vajrayana, if you have, the Vajrayana system, which takes the fruit as the path, meaning the difference between the Vajrayana and ordinary Mahayana is in Vajrayana we practice with the standpoint that the fruit, the goal, Buddhahood, is presently within us, as there's no essential difference between the Buddha's mind and our mind. They're all one continuum, as I briefly mentioned. So if we've encountered the Vajrayana through receiving the appropriate initiations and instructions, then you can practice this exchange of self and others by training in the purification of the vessel, the world, and its contents through the emanation and absorption of lights by means of the path of the 2 stages. 2 stages are in Anuttara Tantra practice, the Cherim, the development stage, where you generate yourself in the form of the deity, and the world as palace of the deities, and all beings as the deities of that palace. and the Zorim or completion stage, where you train in the absorption of the environment, the beings and oneself into the clear light of luminosity. So in that way, by the training in the radiation of the lights to transform the world in beings and the absorption of the world in beings into the clear light, you are training in exchanging self and others. You're purifying the suffering of others. You're practicing the sending of the happiness to others and the purification of their suffering. So Vajrayana practitioners should consider that the way in which they practice sending and taking. Or another example, for instance, if you're practitioners of Hevajra, in the body of Hevajra there are 16 arms. The 8 right arms represent the taking of the sufferings of others. The 8 left hands represent the radiation of the positivity to others. So there are many such instructions in the Vajrayana, which are in harmony with the Lojong practice of sending and taking. So whether one practices the ordinary Mahayana way or the extraordinary Mahayana way of the Vajrayana, you can do this practice. And in this way you will train to have the full compassion of a Buddha, in which you can directly practice exchanging self and others. And again, to support this practice, to develop this attitude, Rinpoche says, give medicine, food, clothing, and material assistance to those who are now enduring physical suffering, and carefully use your resources to benefit those undergoing mental suffering. So again, as trainees in this way, beginners in this way, we can find many opportunities to assist others, and we should see that as yet another way of sending happiness and virtue to others, in this case by materially aiding them. And take responsibility for anyone who is troubled in body, speech or mind, and train in the bodhisattva conduct of exchanging self and others. So, in a way, the bodhisattva way is a way of universal responsibility. Up till now, one is considered, at best, one is just responsible for oneself. And I suppose that is consistent with the Shravaka idea. But in the Bodhisattva we say, may I be the servant of all beings, may I be the support of all beings. So it's like one says, I'll take responsibility for that. Therefore, when one meets people who have difficulties, one should always ask oneself, what can I do for you? What is it I can give? What is it I can give to you? And one should examine, do I have the capability to help others? Of course, sometimes one will see, I don't have that particular capability. For instance, if they're afflicted by a particular physical suffering, perhaps I don't have medical skills. I'd actually cause more harm if I try to do something medically for them. But still in one's heart, one should wish to be able to do so, and assist them, if possible, to attain the necessary medical help. So others' difficulties are always, in a way, something one should respond to. One should feel connected with. One should feel it's not simply something I can disregard or walk away from. I've committed myself to help all sentient beings, and that includes the most troubled. Not just those who are happy and who it's pleasant to meet and help, but those who are difficult. Training the bodhisattva conduct of exchanging self and others. Be diligent in skillful means to transform whatever happens into the path of enlightenment. So that is the first point, driving all blame into one. I think maybe it's good to make one thing, or to suggest that one thing is very important so we don't misunderstand this teaching. which is, to whom is this teaching directed? And the answer is to me. It's directed towards me. It's I who should drive all blame into one. I who should do that. And why? Because I need to excise, I need to cut out, to root out my poisonous habit of self-clinging. Because that's the cause of my suffering and the suffering I inflict on others. I'm an enemy to the world. I'm an enemy to myself in a way too. And so I need to deal with that at source. And the best way to do that is to reverse my habitual habit of blaming others and take it onto oneself. Now, how could I misapply that teaching? Well, Rinpoche has just told us, take responsibility for anyone who is troubled in body, speech or mind. If you misuse this teaching, you would do the opposite of that. When people are troubled, you would say to them, it's your fault. Drive all blame into yourself. That's actually not kind and compassionate. If they've entered into the Bodhisattva path and sincerely entered into it, and it would be helpful to remind them of this instruction so they can go further, yes, that will be skillful and helpful to suggest that. But in many cases it would not be, because they're not practicing the Mahayana, and they need they need your sympathy and compassion and practical help if you're able to give it. So, there's this popular and overused phrase, victim blaming. We're not victim blaming. If there is difficulties afflicting others, we should step up and try to help them. Not use this teaching to victim blame. Not use this in that way. It is our responsibility. So the sole audience for this teaching is me. That's the sole audience. Of course, if others have, as I say, sincerely entered to the Mahayana, and maybe it's somebody who just simply momentarily forgot this teaching, you might in a friendly way just encourage them by reminding them of it. If you judge that they still have the strength to use that teaching. But this is very, very important to understand and not misapply the teaching. Well, it's just a few minutes left. Okay, so we'll do the next instruction. I think, His Holiness Karmapa's answered all questions from this universe and countless other universes. So I just press on. I keep on pressing on. So Geshe Chekawa says, next line, reflect on the great kindness of all. Since the temporary and ultimate benefits of all excellent factors without exception, the best, which is bodhicitta, and the path of application, the second of the 5 paths to enlightenment, the 6 perfections, the 4 limitlesses, and the ultimate level of Buddhahood, all of these great Dharma factors, they arise in dependence upon sentient beings. Where do they come from? The answer is sentient beings. Like Shantideva says in Bodhicharita, and I think His Holiness mentioned, we should be grateful to the Buddhas for their teaching. But Shantideva says we should equally be grateful to sentient beings, because who prompts us to have compassion? The answer is there in the story of Buddha that we've just mentioned. Who prompted Buddha to have compassion? His fellow hell being who was having sufferings. So in a way, that's who started Buddha's path to Buddhahood. Similarly, it's our encounter with others who prompt us to have bodhicitta, to make the decision to become a Buddha for others, that all the qualities we might develop in the path, they come from that encounter with somebody who's troubled, somebody who has difficulty. So then one should therefore reflect, as Rinpoche says, without bias upon the great kindness of all. And that means truly it's all beings, not just pleasant people, nice people who directly help you, but all beings, including the difficult ones, to whom we should be grateful. Because sooner or later, our path will grow through encountering difficult beings and developing the patience that His Holiness has been talking about. Without those difficult beings, there'd never be any patience. If everything is smooth and easy, you never have to stretch yourself. Your mind never has to open wide. So the enemy is the teacher, as again Shantideva says, and His Holiness told us. So therefore our gratitude should be impartial to the great kindness of all. Any being, so Rinpoche then continues, any being that does us harm, whether an enemy, a demon, a karmic creditor, it means all those we've harmed in the past, they are in a way coming to collect that debt that we owe them, is a kind friend of the perfection of patience. Pacify any feeling of ill will towards them, because they are helpers. You